Yes, sir.
Today,
6 o'clock.
today,
Can we
today
start the session, sir?
20, this webinar happens to 25th webinar.
Yes, sir. Yes.
That's what my wife told me just now. You talked about phone. Should I mention it?
Please, sir. Please.
Okay.
Sir, it is 6 o'clock. Can we start the session, sir?
Sure. I'm ready.
Good evening. A warm welcome to all of you to the webinar series hosted by Advocates Association Bengaluru. We have with us today Mr. Ishwar S. Antin, former principal district and sessions judge Shimoga. Sir, on the special episode of 25th webinar, we are privileged to have you with us today. Welcome to the webinar. With great pleasure, now I would like to introduce our today's speaker, Mr. Ishwar S. Antin, obtained his law degree from RL Law College, Belgaum, and enrolled as an advocate in the year 1974. Joined the Karnataka State Judiciary in 1980. He was the former principal district and sessions judge at Shimoga and also has served as the presiding officer at Karnataka Road Transport Corporation Tribunal. He served as the principal special judge for CBI cases at Bengaluru. He also served as the additional director, Karnataka Judicial Academy, Bengaluru. He was the registrar, administration, High Court of Karnataka at Bengaluru. He was the professor, faculty of law at the Administrative Training Institute, Mysuru. He was the presiding officer of the Industrial Tribunal at Mysuru. Presently, he is active as a resource person training judicial officers at Judicial Academy and a member of the Indian Council of Arbitration at New Delhi. As an arbitrator, he has adjudicated several disputes between mining companies, railways, private airlines, pharmaceutical companies, and many more. He is empaneled as an arbitrator by the Honorable High Court of Karnataka for the Arbitration and Conciliation Center, Bengaluru. Sir, on behalf of Advocates Association, Bengaluru, I extend a warm welcome to you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Trivikram, for the privilege accorded to me. It's a happy coincidence that this webinar happens to be 25th webinar in the second series organized by Bangalore Bar Association. At the outset, I would assure the learned members of the bar that I will not inflict upon them a long-winded talk. I'm conscious of my limitations. I'm more presuming that than becomes me if I claim to be adequate to cover the whole gamut of the subject that is plural and diverse. I must confess that nature has been niggardly in endowing me with analytical faculties. The administration of justice in the context of enforcement of the marriage laws has suffered from intractable complexities of modern society. There has been a cultural churn in India. There is a growing trend of decriminalization of alternative sexuality. There is a legal recognition of live-in relationship. Some youngsters might find me long in the tooth to appreciate these modern concepts. It is not like shooting a fish in a barrel. Today, the subject for discussion is Special Marriage Act. There are many laws enacted in India relating to marriages. We have a Special Marriage Act, Hindu Marriage Act, Christian Marriage Act, and Foreign Marriage Act. In this session, I'll be focusing on Special Marriage Act, the broad features I would like to relate in this session. It may not be out of context to discuss a few provisions of the Hindu Marriage Act because the personal law of marriage relating to Hindus merits to be juxtaposed with the Special Marriage Act. A careful analysis of the relevant provisions would indicate that there are many common features and common concepts between Hindu Marriage Act and the Special Marriage Act. As for Special Marriage Act, there are 51 sections subsumed in 8 chapters, and it contains 5 schedules. Before discussing the chapter and verse of this act, let me relate in some detail the application of Hindu Marriage Act. The Hindu Marriage Act is a personal marriage law relating to Hindus only. The word Hindu has been defined under the Act, Hindu Marriage Act, stating that it includes Buddhists, Jains, Veerashaiva, Lingayat, etc. It won't cover Christians or Muslims, Jews or Parsis. At the risk of repetition, I may emphasize that it would govern only the Hindus. A marriage between 2 Hindus alone is possible under the Hindu Marriage Act. Let me relate an instance. A Hindu fell in love with a girl in Japan, and he brought her to India and married her according to the customary rites prevalent in his community in India. You may be aware that Japanese belong to Buddhist race. They come under the definition of Hindu for that purpose. After the performance of the marriage of this Japanese girl with a Hindu in India, they applied for marriage certificate. This marriage certificate could not be issued. It was declined on the ground that the Japanese girl did not have the domicile in India, because one of the relevant conditions in respect of the foreigners or the persons staying outside the territory of India should have a domicile in India in order that Hindu Marriage Act should govern the spouses. So on this ground, marriage certificate was declined to this Japanese girl. If the parties reside outside India, there's a requirement of domicile. That comes within the definition of Hindu Marriage Act when we examine the application of the Hindu Marriage Act. What is the scope of Special Marriage Act? Who are eligible to get married under the provisions of Special Marriage Act? Is the next question that for consideration. Any person, any 2 persons can marry under the Special Marriage Act, whether it is a Christian marriage between a Christian or a Muslim, or a Hindu or a Muslim, or a Hindu or a Christian. So it is possible for one Hindu to marry another Hindu even under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. There will be instances where, as for persons residing in Kashmir, there is a special provision which indicates that the spouses, the parties to the marriage should have a domicile they should be citizens of India and they should have domicile in the territory of India. That is one, except that rider, this act would apply to any persons of any community, any religion for that matter. This is a broad scope of Special Marriage Act. I may repeat for the sake of emphasis that any 2 persons can marry under the Special Marriage Act, irrespective of their religion, caste. A Hindu can also marry another Hindu under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. That is a scope. Generally speaking, as our experience goes, these persons belong to other communities or other religions, to be more precise, prefer to get married under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. There will be instances where a boy and a girl who are incurably romantic may resort to what is called a Gretna Green marriage. They turn to their cater cousin and reveal their relationship or intimacy. The cater cousin would advise them that the romance has led to the altar. They should get spliced. Because of the possible resistance from the family members, they resort to what is called as Gretna Green marriage, that is marrying in a surreptitious way. They leave their parental places and move away from the place of the residence and prefer to get married under the Special Marriage Act. Under the Special Marriage Act, there are two modes of getting married. In other words, the Special Marriage Act recognizes two modes of marriage. What are these two modes as recognized by the Special Marriage Act? This marriage enables the marriage of any two persons, as I already emphasized. They may seek solemnization of the marriage. Firstly, they seek solemnization of the marriage under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. The process involves giving of notice to intended marriage, waiting for objections. There is a requirement of stay of at least 1 month in the place of marriage office, at the place of marriage officer. That is, to be more precise, at the station of the marriage officer. And notice of intended marriage is given to the marriage officer. It is followed by possible objections from the third parties or objectors. Thereafter, if any objections are received, objections are heard and disposed of. Supposing the marriage officer declines to perform the marriage, or if he refuses to perform the marriage, there's an appeal provided to the district court. That's a different thing. So let me complete the discussion regarding the first mode of marriage under the Special Marriage Act. That is solemnization of the marriage, followed by its registration. That's very important. Solemnization would include, it is not performance of the marriage as per customary rites, please. It is solemnization takes place under the provisions of the Special Marriage Act itself. That is the emphasis which I want to lay here. Solemnization of the marriage under the Special Marriage Act takes place under the provisions of the Act itself. The process involves or starts with giving of notice of intended marriage, followed by objections and hearing, etc. And there's the procedure of taking signatures of 3 witnesses. And there's a declaration by the parties, boy and the girl. They are mentioned in the schedule annexed to the Act, followed by entry of the marriage certificate in the book called Marriage Certificate Book. Then the process is complete. This is one mode of getting married under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. What is the other mode that is recognized by these provisions of the Special Marriage Act? That is marrying in other form. That is Chapter 3 of the Act. So far, I discussed the provisions contained in Chapter 2 of the Special Marriage Act, dealing with solemnization of the marriage between any two persons, followed by its registration, as per the statute requirements of making declaration and obtaining the signatures of 3 witnesses. There's a prescribed format under which a declaration is made. The second mode, as recognized by the Special Marriage Act, as I already told you, consists only of going for registration. Marriage is already performed in some other form. Maybe it is a Hindu marriage, performed according to the customary rites. Fine. But for the purpose of registration, they invoke the aid of the provisions of Special Marriage Act, that is Chapter 3 of the Special Marriage Act. The parties come to the marriage officer, make an application for registration of marriage. Supposing all the conditions required for fulfillment, valid conditions of the marriage are fulfilled, the marriage officer would permit them to get married under the provisions of Chapter 3 of the Special Marriage Act. This is only registration. There is no solemnization, please. At the risk of repetition, I may emphasize, in Chapter 3, there is no solemnization of a marriage. What chapter 3 contemplates is only registration of marriage. Marriage is already performed, not under the Special Marriage Act, but under some other form. It could be customary marriage or in some other form recognized by law. Only for the limited purpose of registering the marriage, they approach the registration marriage officer. That is also recognized by the provisions of Special Marriage Act. Thus, to put it in a nutshell, there are two modes of recognizing the marriage under the Special Marriage Act. One is solemnization, followed by registration under Chapter 2. The second one is marriage is already performed in other forms can be got registered under Chapter 3 of the Special Marriage Act. This marriage could be between any two persons belonging to any religion, irrespective of caste or religion. This is the emphasis which I want to make. So what are the conditions of valid marriage? That's also equally important. They are found in Section 4 of the Special Marriage Act. The relevant law prevents bigamous marriage. There should not be any subsisting marriage when the parties approach or seek solemnization of marriage under the Special Act. For the sake of clarity and clear understanding, I would refer to the marriage under the Special Marriage Act as only special marriage, so that it becomes easier. Every time if I make use of the expression marriage under the Special Marriage Act, it would have deconcerting effect. You may exhibit a disquieting inclination to hear this expression frequently. So what I propose to do is the marriage under the Special Marriage Act would be referred to by me as special marriage. Whenever I use the expression special marriage, please understand it as marriage under the Special Marriage Act. So this special marriage can be performed subject to the conditions laid down under Section 4. What are the conditions of valid marriage are laid down in Section 4? The spouse should not have, neither party has a living spouse. And neither party is incapable of giving a valid consent in consequence of unsoundness of mind. Then, though capable of giving a valid consent, should not suffer from mental disorder of such a kind or to such an extent as to be unfit for marriage and the procreation of children. This is another condition. Thirdly, the other party should not be subject to recurrent attacks of insanity. Then comes the next condition that relates to age factor. The male must have completed the age of 21 years and the female the age of 18 years. Lastly, and more importantly, they should not come within the degree of prohibited relationship. These grounds are also mentioned in Section 5 of the Hindu Marriage Act because the comparative study becomes necessary. As for special marriage, these conditions need to be fulfilled in order that parties can seek solemnization of marriage under Chapter 2 of the Act. This is Special Marriage Act. So this requirement of parties not falling within the degrees of prohibited relationship has a rider to it. Rider means an exception. What is that exception? If there is any custom permitting the parties to get married among the relatives who fall with the degrees of prohibited relationship, there is no problem for the parties because such custom would operate as an exception to the main rule or the main requirement of ensuring that they do not come under the degrees of prohibited relationship. Who are the persons falling within a degree of prohibited relationship? There are as many as 37 legal parties. They are mentioned in first schedule only, Part 1 and Part 2. For instance, mother, father's widow, mother's mother, brothers, sisters, etc. In Part 2 also, father, mother's husband, father's father, mother's father. As many as 37 relatives are mentioned in Schedule 1, that is first schedule. they come under the degrees of prohibited relationship. Supposing there is any custom to the contrary, permitting the parties to marry within the prohibited, it is permissible. So in order that a custom can be held valid, there are three tests to be fulfilled. You should have antiquity, continuity, and reasonableness. There's a principle called custom cannot be enlarged by parity of reasoning, nor one custom deduced from another. A custom may be prevalent in a particular community, in a particular area. That doesn't mean that that custom can be extended to the same community in another area. In the UP, there was a custom called throwing away of the thali to effect divorce. In North Karnataka, some of you may be aware that there's a practice of effecting divorce by customary method consisting in the execution of documents styled as Sodapatra and Bedpatra. In fact, I had the privilege of deciding a case involving such customary method of execution of documents to prove the validity of divorce. So let me not digress. So these are the important principles. But when it comes to the second mode of seeking registration in chapter 2 of the Act, we can notice certain changes in the conditions. Interestingly, at the time of registration of the marriage, under chapter 3 of the Act, what is important is the bride should also have attained the age of 21. That's very interesting. It makes a departure from usual conditions. So far as the solemnization and registration of marriage, under chapter 2, normal conditions of valid marriage are enumerated. Relating to age factor, what is stated is girl should have attained the age of 18 years. Even on the Hindu Marriage Act, there is a requirement of attainment of age of 18 years by the girl. But when it comes to registration, I don't know what the purpose behind it. Legislature, its wisdom, has imposed that condition. For the purpose of registration on the chapter 3, there's a requirement of girl attaining the age of 21 years, not 18, please. The distinction is made between chapter 2 and chapter 3 in the matter of performance of the marriage under the Special Marriage Act. So perhaps legislature in its wisdom thought that girl would be more mature, supposing the marriage is performed because under chapter 3, marriage is already performed. It is not under the Special Marriage Act. Under chapter 3, parties or the spouses approach the marriage officer only for the limited purpose of registration. I already emphasized that. Only for the limited purpose of registration they approach. Marriage is already performed in some customary method, as recognized by law in some other form. That is what the legislation says here. Marriage is already performed in some other form. Only for the limited purpose of registration, they approach the marriage officer under chapter 3 of the Act. So in that scenario, there's a requirement of law that girls should also attain the age of 21 years. Both these spouses should have attained the age of 21 years. That is all the significant change so far as chapter 3 is concerned. And there is no requirement of giving notice of intended marriage under chapter 3. That's one more important fact. The distinction between these two modes of marriage under the Special Marriage Act, in the first part, that is chapter 2, solemnization as well as registration takes place. In chapter 3, as already discussed or explained in some detail, marriage is already performed in some other form. Parties or spouses approach the marriage officer only for the limited purpose of registration. So the changes regarding conditions of valid marriage are indicated in section 15. Again, usual conditions are enumerated there. That a ceremony of marriage has been performed between the marriage parties and they have been living together as husband and wife ever since. So it bears repetition that a ceremony of marriage has been performed already. But there is no emphasis on the observation of customary rights. What you can notice in section 15A, clause A is, there is no insistence regarding compliance with the customary rights of either party. All that is stated is a ceremony of marriage has been performed. How do you understand this expression, a ceremony of marriage? Since there is no insistence on observance of customary rights as required under the Hindu Marriage Act. Hindu Marriage Act requires observance of customary rights. If there is a Saptapadi system, it has to be followed, subject to the condition that that custom should be in existence. Subject to that rider, custom is required to be followed. Not in each and every case, Saptapadi is required to be followed. That is taking 7 steps around the sacred fire. That is not there. Of course, in the modern era, this requirement of 7th step fades into insignificance in the face of living relationship. That's a different aspect. So what I'm trying to emphasize is, under section 15, dealing with registration of marriage celebrated in other forms, falling within chapter 3, what is required to be looked into, the conditions laid down therein. The first and the foremost condition is a ceremony of marriage has been performed between the parties and they have been living together as husband and wife ever since. Neither party has at the time of registration more than one spouse, that is, bigamy is prevented, bigamous marriage. Third condition is, it doesn't specifically relate to unsoundness of mind or recurrent attacks of insanity. All that it says is, neither party is an idiot or lunatic at the time of registration. It's very interesting. It makes a departure from the normal condition of either spouse being insane or suffering from unsoundness of mind or not capable of giving consent, etc. Emphasis is laid in chapter 2 for the purpose of solemnization of marriage on the requirement of either spouse being of sound mind. But all that has been stated for the purpose of registration here is neither party is an idiot or lunatic at the time of registration. The word idiot or lunatic is not defined under the Act. That to be understood in the common parlance what is stated there by idiot or lunatic. Again, as I told you just now, there's a requirement of both boy and the girl having attained the age of 21 years. This is the departure from chapter 2. In chapter 2, the requirement regarding age is 21 and 18 years. For the boy, it is 21 years. For the girl, it is 18. But in chapter 3, only for the purpose of registration, the marriage registrar would insist on the age of bride. That is, to be more precise, wife, because marriage is already performed. Wife should have attained, or spouse should have attained the age of 21. To be more precise, both boy and the girl should have attained the age of 21 years for the purpose of registration under chapter 3 of the Act. This is also a recognized mode of marriage as contemplated by the Special Marriage Act. And again, there is a prohibited relationship. I have already explained in some detail about the parties falling under within the degrees of prohibited. That is prohibited. That is again subject to the rider of custom, etc. So what is the effect of issuance of registration certificate? In chapter 3, it has the same effect. Marriage is deemed to have been performed under the Special Marriage Act. Even if the customary rites are performed as per the provisions of Hindu Marriage Act, if both the parties are Hindus and they prefer to marry according to the customary rites, and they come to the marriage officer only for the limited purpose of registration under the Special Marriage Act, what is the legal consequence? This marriage is deemed to have been performed under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. Please try to appreciate the consequence of going for registration under the Special Marriage Act. The parties have already solemnized their marriage as per their customary rights, though it is under Hindu Marriage Act or some other forms, but only for the limited purpose of getting their marriage registered, which is permissible under the Special Marriage Act. Then there's a declaration by law, statutory declaration, that is section 18, is very relevant for your purpose. Make a note of section 18. Effect of registration of marriage under this chapter. Subject to the provisions contained in subsection 2 of section 24, where a certificate of marriage has been finally entered in the marriage certificate book under this chapter, the marriage shall, as from the date of such entry, be deemed to be a marriage solemnized under this act. Though there is no solemnization, strictly speaking, solemnization is already done or made as per the customary rights. Still, they have chosen to invoke the aid of Special Marriage Act for the limited purpose of registration. In view of section 18, it is deemed to have been solemnized under the Special Marriage Act. This is the significance of section 18. You have to make a distinction between chapter 2 and chapter 3 here. Chapter 2 deals with solemnization as well as registration. Chapter 3 only deals with the registration. Marriage is already performed. But the effect of section 18 is, even though the marriage is not strictly solemnized under the provisions of Special Marriage Act, the parties have only approached only for the limited purpose of registration. Still, in view of section 18, the effect is the marriage is deemed to have been solemnized under the provisions of Special Marriage. I will touch upon gray areas in the due course. So let me highlight the procedure for the special and under the Special Marriage Act. Please examine the third schedule if you have a Bare Act with you. Second schedule deals with notice of intended marriage. Notice is issued by either spouse or a party regarding the intended marriage as required under section 5. The particulars mentioned therein need to be given to the marriage officer. The third schedule dealing under section 11 deals with declaration to be made by the bridegroom as well as the bride. What is this declaration? The procedure should be clearly understood. What is the declaration required to be made both by the bridegroom and the bride as per section 11? There is a format for that. The third schedule. I so and so, that is in respect of bridegroom, declare as follows. I am at the present time unmarried. That declaration has to be made. Firstly, he must state that he is unmarried. Secondly, he must state about his age. He has completed the age, obviously 21 years of age, as per the requirement of law. And he must also say that he doesn't fall within the degrees of prohibited relationship with the wife. I am not related to the bride, that is CD, within the degrees of prohibited relationship. Lastly, he must make another declaration. This is more important. I am aware that if any statement in the declaration is false, he undertakes. What is that undertaking? If he makes a false declaration, he is liable to imprisonment and also to fine. With the full understanding or full knowledge of the legal consequences, he makes a declaration before the marriage office. This is all stated in the format. In a similar way, bride is also required to make a declaration before the marriage office. Thereafter, it will be signed by 3 witnesses. The requirement is it has to be signed by 3 witnesses, not 1 or 2. 3 witnesses, mandatory. And it will be countersigned by the marriage office. So this is the requirement of solemnization marriage under the chapter 2, under chapter 2 of the Special Marriage Act. Followed by certificate of marriage is issued under section 3. It is contained in 4th schedule. And the last important schedule is 5th schedule. It is a certificate of marriage celebrated in other forms. Other forms, they are contained in chapter 3. Because marriage is already performed in other form, parties have approached the marriage officer for the limited purpose of issuance of marriage certificate. That is also recognized. It is stated as a valid marriage. for all practical purposes or legal purposes, it is marriage deemed to have been solemnized under the Special Marriage Act. Though that is strictly speaking, there is no solemnization under Chapter 3. But for the legal purpose, as per the statutory declaration made by Section 18, it is a marriage deemed to have been solemnized under the Special Marriage Act. For that purpose, the marriage officer would issue certificate of marriage celebrated in other forms covered by Section 16. The format is in 5th schedule. So having understood the requirement of procedure to be followed under the Special Marriage Act, now we'll touch upon some other important concepts which are common to both the Hindu Marriage Act as well as Special Marriage Act. There are concepts like desertion, judicial separation, divorce, nullity of marriage on the ground of marriage being either void or voidable. Then there is a provision for restitution of conjugal rights. What are the 5 matrimonial reliefs that can be granted, that can be conceived under the marriage laws, whether it is Special Marriage Act or Hindu Marriage Act? Because these matrimonial reliefs are common to the parties under the 2 enactments. What are the 5 matrimonial reliefs? One could be nullity of marriage on the ground of marriage either being void or voidable. The other could be for restitution of conjugal rights, if the one party withdraws from the society of another without any reasonable excuse. That would give rise to an action for seeking relief of restitution of conjugal rights. That is another relief. Nullity of marriage or restitution of conjugal rights, then judicial separation, or it could be divorce. So let me explain in some detail the scope of these matrimonial reliefs that can be conceived of under the Special Marriage Act. Restitution of conjugal rights can be sought when one party withdraws from the society of the other without any reasonable cause. That's very important. Secondly, there's a concept called judicial separation, which can be sought by the aggrieved party. What is the scope of judicial separation? What is the distinction between judicial separation and divorce? That needs to be explained in some detail. There's a distinction between judicial separation and divorce. Judicial separation may be understood as an interim measure. It does not put an end to the marriage in a permanent way. There is no severance of marital status altogether in a judicial separation. It is only an interim measure enabling the parties or giving an opportunity to the parties to rejoin or patch up the differences. There is a possibility of their listening to reason and going by the advice of elders and burying their differences. Marriage can be saved. That is one opportunity to be more precise. That is the purpose for which this order for judicial separation is passed by the courts. What are the grounds on which judicial separation can be sought? There are none other than the grounds for which divorce is available. On divorce can be sought. Same grounds. The grounds available for seeking divorce are also available for seeking judicial separation. That's important. So what are the grounds for, common grounds for seeking either relief, whether judicial separation or divorce? Generally speaking, it is cruelty, it could be adultery, it could be desertion, it could be conversion to another religion. So far as the Hindu Marriage Act, here conversion question doesn't come here because it is a Special Marriage Act. because only converts would prefer to get married under Special Marriage Act. It sounds incongruous to say that conversion could be a ground for seeking divorce under the Special Marriage Act. Only converts prefer to come under the Special Marriage Act. So broadly speaking, it is adultery, cruelty, insanity, then not being heard of for 7 years. These are the grounds on which divorce could be sought. So let me be more precise. I already told you about the other grounds like adultery, then desertion. And there is one more important ground which makes a distinction from Hindu Marriage Act. It's a special ground for seeking divorce under the Special Marriage Act. This ground relates to either party undergoing a sentence of imprisonment for 7 years or more. This is one special ground on which divorce can be sought. If either party is undergoing a sentence of imprisonment for 7 years or more, that constitutes a ground for seeking divorce under the provisions of Special Marriage Act in the contemplation of Section 27. And the unsoundness of mind is another order. What is this unsoundness of mind or insanity? It is not every kind of insanity that can be treated as a valid ground for seeking divorce. It is not every kind of frantic humor that can be called insanity. A man may be suffering from some sort of insanity in the sense in which the term is used by medical men and not by legal men. So it has to be understood in its proper perspective. So unsoundness of mind could be one of the grounds. It should be incurable. That's more important. It should be incurable. And the other condition on which divorce could be sought is person suffering from venereal disease in a communicable form. That's more important. And again, there is one more ground. If either party suffers from leprosy, and lastly, if it has not been heard of for a period of 7 years or more by those who would naturally have heard of it, that constitutes the last ground for seeking divorce. These grounds for seeking divorce are also available for seeking the relief of judicial separation. So I may emphasize that the grounds available for seeking divorce are also available for seeking an order for judicial separation. Judicial separation does not sever the marital status totally. It's only an interim measure. A further process is necessary. The process. So unless divorce takes place, the process doesn't play out. It requires a couple of years to play out the process. So what should be understood here is these grounds are common both for the relief of divorce and judicial separation. So when it comes to the ground of desertion, I would like to explain it in some detail. What is desertion? The concept of desertion is not clearly understood by some of us, those who have not dabbled in marriage laws, who have not practiced in family law. The youngsters may not be aware of this concept of desertion. What is desertion? Desertion is staying away separately. One spouse is staying away separately from the other spouse for a period of more than 2 years. That is not sufficient. If the separation is for a period of 2 years, that alone is not sufficient. It doesn't constitute the element of desertion. What is required to be established to prove desertion? Let me explain in some detail. So I will refer to the parties here, agreed parties, as a deserted spouse and deserting spouse. That's how we should understand it. Now, to understand the concept of the desertion clearly, the parties or spouses should be referred to as deserted spouse and deserting spouse. I hope I made myself clear. Deserted spouse is obviously an agreed person in normal circumstances. Of course, deserting spouse may also be justified in deserting the other spouse. That is a different thing. Normally speaking, who is a deserted spouse? I will give a hypothetical situation of wife deserting the husband, leaving the matrimonial home. She reaches the parental house and stays there. So in such scenarios, husband becomes a deserted spouse. Wife becomes deserting spouse, one who leaves the other spouse. It's called deserting spouse. What is required to be established here to prove desertion as a ground for seeking divorce? Deserted spouse, that is husband, should establish satisfactorily that there was absence of consent on his part. Absence of consent. What do you mean by absence of consent? He has not consented for wife leaving the matrimonial home. That is absence of consent. Without his consent, she has left. That's the meaning, implication. Absence of consent. That is not the end of the matter. We should also establish that the absence of conduct on his part. What is that conduct? Motivating the lady to leave the matrimonial home. In other words, he is not guilty of any misconduct. There is absence of such misconduct on his part. On his part, he has to establish these two elements. There is absence of consent. In other words, he has not consented for the wife to leave the matrimonial home. Secondly, he is also not guilty of misconduct, which means that absence of conduct motivating the deserting spouse to leave the matrimonial. So these two elements need to be established on the part of the deserted spouse. In addition, we should also establish before the court that the deserting spouse left the matrimonial home or deserted him without any valid reasons. More importantly, and which is by far the most relevant factor to reckon with, there is an animus deserendi on the part of deserting spouse. What do you mean by animus deserendi? Animus deserendi is an intention to put an end to the cohabitation. That's very important in desertion. An intention to put an end to cohabitation, that animus, it's called as legal maxim is animus deserendi. So if these facts are established, then desertion stands established. That could constitute a valid ground for seeking divorce. Of course, there is some explanation for desertion also. The expression desertion means desertion of the petitioner by the other party to the marriage without reasonable cause and without the consent or against the wish of such party, and includes a willful neglect. That's important. It is an inclusive definition. Of course, willful neglect sometimes becomes difficult because staying apart from each other may be easily proved by the parties. Supposing a boy goes to America or Australia, he stays there for some job there. He's trying to seek visa for a wife also. There cannot be a case for proving desertion because they have no intention to put an end to cohabitation there. Though the other conditions are satisfied here. He's away from his wife for a period of more than 2 years. He said he's staying separately. In the case of a grass widower who stays away from the wife. Grass widower is one whose wife is temporarily absent. So it cannot be a case for desertion. So what is more important, or to understand the concept of desertion correctly, we should examine whether the deserting spouse had an intention to put an end to cohabitation. That's called as animus deserendi. So these are the grounds on which divorce could be sought. And the courts by judicial fiat has introduced another ground also, that is irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. It's very interesting in modern days, this irretrievable breakdown and divorce by mutual consent. Not permitted because there are statutory provisions. Of course, 6 months waiting period there that has been dispensed with in the form of case law. advocates rush to invoke the aid of the press into service these decisions of the Apex Court as well as our Honorable High Court to seek exemption of this waiting period of 6 months. That is a different aspect. So, court by its judicial fiat cannot invent a new ground, strictly speaking. Irretrievable breakdown of marriage. What is this irretrievable breakdown? It is not every incompatibility, case of incompatibility which can be termed as irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. Suppose in a given case, a wife belonging to highbrow culture finds her husband a bit of a square and vexatious to her high spirit. The husband, who is orthodox and very conservative, may notice that his wife is supercilious and he would abominate her nonchalant attitude or insouciant behavior. Can you call it as incompatibility? Incompatibility cannot be a ground to treat a marriage or an irretrievable breakdown of marriage. So each and every case of differences between the spouses cannot be treated or termed as irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. See, human nature differs from person to person. Some are extroverts, some are introverts, some are ambiverts. Some may not remain consistent throughout their life. It is said that consistency is contrary to human nature. The only consistent people are the dead ones. So we must try to appreciate these aspects to understand the true spirit of the law contained in section 27, which deals with divorce. Whenever divorce is sought on any of these grounds, except on the ground of either spouse being not being heard of for a period of 7 years, court has a discretion. As you know, family courts deal with these matrimonial matters. I have picked the brains of my friends working in family courts also to get some input. So courts would be slow in granting divorce. The family courts would instead choose to pass a decree for judicial separation instead of granting divorce. Court has a discretion in the matter. What I am trying to emphasize here or impress upon you is merely because a petition for divorce is made before the family court, court is not bound to grant it. Court has a discretion either to grant divorce or to grant decree for judicial separation. As I told you just now, judicial separation is intended to enable the parties to reunite, to patch up their differences, to listen to reason. If such possibility is there and the parties are in a conciliatory frame of mind, they can be persuaded to decide upon a settlement. If they reunite, fine, marriage is safe. There is no requirement of continuing this order for judicial separation. They can conveniently ask the court to rescind it or cancel it. Alternatively, they may wait for a period of 1 year and seek divorce. It is a step in aid to seek divorce. This order for judicial separation is a step in aid for divorce. It is not a final order, please. It may not be correct analogy, like a preliminary decree in a civil proceeding. Final decree is not yet passed. Divorce is a final decree. But it may not be correct analogy according to me. I speak under correction. So what you should understand is a decree or order for judicial separation is only an interim measure. It would enable the parties to wait for a period of 1 year. If there is no cohabitation, the parties can again approach the family court and ask for divorce. Likewise, if there is an order for restitution of conjugal rights, And if there is no cohabitation for a period of 1 year, there is no compliance, then parties can ask for divorce. There is a requirement of law to wait for a period of 1 year after these two orders are passed. Decree for restitution of conjugal rights as well as order for judicial separation. They can't rush to the family court to seek divorce. Divorce can be sought in normal circumstances, fine. If court is magnanimous or it has a discretion to entertain the divorce petition and grant the relief, fine, no problem. But in view of the special provision regarding divorce by mutual consent, there is no requirement of passing any order for judicial separation. It is in normal circumstances. If divorce is sought on any of the specified grounds contained in section 27, court has a discretion, not otherwise. So this is how the grounds of divorce should be tried. And there is also a distinction between the Hindu Marriage Act as well as Special Marriage Act. Impotence and unsoundness of mind are not treated as the grounds for treating the marriage as void under the Hindu Marriage Act. Under the Special Marriage Act, both impotence and unsoundness of mind as treated as grounds for treating the marriage as void. That's another important thing. So having understood the scope of these provisions, divorce, I would briefly touch upon the corresponding provisions under the Hindu Marriage Act. When it comes to conditions of valid marriage, they are enumerated in Section 5 of the Hindu Marriage Act, which corresponds to Section 4 of the Special Marriage Act. Section 9 of the Hindu Marriage Act, followed by 10, 11, and 12, correspond to Sections 22, 23, 24, and 25 of the Special Marriage Act. Divorce contained in Section 13 and 13A under the Hindu Marriage Act are referable to Section 27 and 27A of the Special Marriage Act. Then mutual divorce is contained in 13B of the Hindu Marriage Act, whereas it is under 28 of the Special Marriage Act. Remarriage is possible in the Section 15 of the Hindu Marriage Act and Section 30 of the Special Marriage Act. And there is also a special provision contained in Section 35 of the Special Marriage Act. It enables the respondent who contests the claim of either spouse to make an alternative claim, like a counterclaim. Suppose the restitution of conjugal rights is sought by the husband, wife can make a counterclaim for divorce. Then I will highlight some distinguishing features of the Hindu marriage, and they are very interesting for your purpose, particularly youngsters. Some are beneficial to ladies. If there is a marriage performed under the Special Marriage Act, the advantage to the lady or wife is that there is no requirement of paying maintenance to the husband in matrimonial, legal proceeding relating to any matrimonial relief under the Special Marriage Act. Please examine the scope of Section 36 and 37 of the Special Marriage Act. They only entitle the wife to seek either temporary alimony or permanent alimony. They do not entitle the husband to seek such similar relief during pendency of the proceeding relating to matrimonial relief. These provisions do not entitle the husband to seek temporary or permanent alimony. They only entitle the wife. That is the distinction. That is the advantage of marrying under Special Marriage Act so far as ladies are concerned. When it comes to Hindu Marriage Act, the relevant provisions are Section 24 and 25, which enable both the spouses, either husband or wife, to seek either temporary or permanent alimony. That is the distinction between these two provisions. Very interesting distinction is there. So there is one more provision under the Special Marriage Act, which according to me sounds incongruous. Judicial separation can be sought even on the ground of non-compliance with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights. If there is non-compliance with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights, it is a valid ground for seeking divorce. Why legislature's wisdom should think of asking for judicial separation, I fail to understand. It stands to reason because there is a decree, already a decree for restitution of conjugal rights. There is no compliance with that order. What should be the remedy available to the aggrieved party? You should wait for 1 year and go for a divorce, he or she, as the case may be. But there's a provision of the a Special Marriage Act, which says that a decree for judicial separation can be sought on the ground of non-compliance with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights. To what purpose? Suppose the aggrieved party approaches the court for the relief of a judicial separation on the ground of non-compliance of restitution of conjugal rights, decree for restitution of conjugal rights. A decree is passed accordingly for judicial separation. There is no divorce. Again, party is required to wait for a mandatory period of 1 year in order that he or she can invoke the aid of relevant provision for divorce. Waiting period continues. And when this non-compliance can be reported, is also not indicated. There is no statutory guidance. There's a gray area. So I will point out the relevant provision dealing with the judicial separation under the Special Marriage Act. Please examine this relevant provision. Section 23, 1B, clause 1B. Judicial separation can be sought on the ground of failure to comply with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights. Failure to comply with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights would enable the aggrieved party to ask for divorce under the succeeding provision. And that is the situation why party should ask for judicial separation. There is no similar provision of the Hindu Marriage Act, which was enacted subsequently. It is the act of the year 54. Hindu Marriage Act was enacted later. So this ground, clause B, it's not discernible from reading of this provision, why this provision has been incorporated. And when this non-compliance can be reported, there is no time limit prescribed. Is it non-compliance for a period of 2 months or 1 year? There is no statutory guidance. Nothing can be inferred from by reading of this clause B. On the ground of failure to comply with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights. Can it be the very next day? This complaint could be made that non-compliance with the decree for restitution of conjugal rights. That's why I want the judicial separation. No such indication is provided. It would have been better for the legislature to leave the remedy to the aggrieved spouse to ask for divorce after waiting for a mandated period of 1 year from the date of decree for restitution of conjugal rights. That would have been in the fitness of things according to me. Anyway, that is a gray area. There is one more interesting aspect of the matter which falls according to me in the gray area only. This is section 24(2). Supposing the marriage has been registered under chapter 3, marriage is already performed in some other form, as I already discussed in some detail, but only for the limited purpose of registration, they come to the marriage officer and get their marriage registered. So this is a valid marriage. This is one of the modes as recognized by the Special Marriage Act. As I repeated just now, there are 2 modes of marriage as recognized by the Special Marriage Act. One is solemnization followed by registration. Other is marriage already performed in other forms and parties approaching the marriage officer for the limited purpose of registration. Even if that is done, as per the statute declaration made in section 18, this is deemed to have been solemnized. The word used is solemnized, though there is no solemnization of the Special Marriage Act. It's deemed to have been solemnized, deeming clause is there. So when this declaration is made under section 18 and registration certificate is issued, then there's a rider that though the marriage is void for any of the violation of some of the conditions of valid marriage, the parties, agreed parties cannot institute any legal proceeding. Try to understand what I'm trying to put across here. Even if there is violation of any of the conditions of valid marriage, even if there is violation of the conditions of valid marriage, and if marriage is deemed to have been performed under Chapter 3 of the Act, Special Act, that is deeming provision, it is deemed to have been solemnized under the Act. Such condition falling within the void marriage is not available to the agreed spouse to institute any legal proceeding. See the mandate of the law. If it is under Chapter 2, if there is solemnization of the marriage followed by registration, the parties are at liberty to challenge the void marriage. There's a clear distinction between void and voidable marriage. Void marriage can be declared by statute as void. It's void ab initio. Or there's also an option in appropriate cases, parties may approach the court for a declaration that declare as marriage is void. So such a situation is possible when there is a dispute regarding the bigamous marriage, and the parties dispute the factum of second marriage. Then there's the need to seek a declaration that the marriage is void, not otherwise. So in normal circumstances, void marriage need not be challenged as being void or they're not binding, because if it is an admitted fact, supposing second wife would assert, no, since she could not beget any child to my husband, he preferred to marry me. This is her stand. It's an admitted fact. It need not be proved. The first wife need not go to court and ask for a declaration that declare that the second marriage of my husband is void. There is no need, because it's an admitted fact. Supposing there is a dispute by the second wife, my marriage alone is valid in law. You are not the legally wedded wife. Then there is a necessity of approaching the law courts or family courts, to be more precise, for a declaration that the second marriage is void. So when it comes to Special Marriage Act, even if the marriage is void for violation of any of the conditions, best example is marriage being, the husband being impotent, or he suffers from unsoundness of mind, or there's a bigamous marriage. Those are the conditions of void marriage. If the marriage is performed under Chapter 3, that is the deemed marriage, then parties are not at liberty to approach the law court and institute legal proceeding for a declaration that marriage is void and not binding on them. No, law doesn't provide. At best, they can ask for cancellation of registration of marriage. That is what the provision says. So what I'm trying to emphasize here or impress upon you is, practically it becomes a voidable marriage. It is at the options of the parties here. Though there is a violation of the valid conditions of marriage. Marriage is void under law in normal circumstances. Because of this deeming provision, because the parties have preferred to adopt alternative method of seeking only registration, they are not allowed in law to approach the family court for a declaration that marriage is not valid and binding, since there is a violation of conditions of valid marriage. In other words, marriage is void. No such complaint can be made by either spouse that marriage is void, though it comes within the definition of void marriage. That's very interesting. This you can notice under section 24. 24.2. Please examine section 24.2. In Chapter 6 of the Special Marriage Act, nothing contained in this section shall apply to any marriage deemed to be solemnized under this act within the meaning of section 18. But the registration of such marriage under Chapter 3 may be declared to be of no effect if the registration was in contravention of any of the conditions specified in clauses A to E of section 2. So the aggrieved party can ask for cancellation of registration but they cannot approach the family court for a declaration that the marriage is void and not binding on them. If marriage is performed in chapter 3 of the Special Marriage Act. This is how the distinction has to be made and understood. Of course, the jurisdiction of the family court is to grant any of the matrimonial reliefs which are already indicated. And there are some gray areas like divorce having taken place, either spouse chooses to remarry after the appeal period is over. In the meantime, the aggrieved party who had lost the case prefers an appeal along with an application for condonation or delay. He or she would succeed in the appeal. Delay is condoned. Appeal is allowed on merits. What is the legal consequence? How do you appreciate such a situation? What should happen to the first wife? First marriage is restored on the strength of his or her success in appeal. What about the second marriage? Second marriage, you can't say that it is void ab initio. When husband took the second wife, it was permissible in law. There was no legal impediment because he preferred to take another wife. After the appeal period was over, there was no embargo, legal impediment. How do you treat the status of second wife? It's also sometimes some principles have been evolved by the Supreme Court. It's called a doctrine of necessity and public policy. In such a situation, both marriages could be held valid. There is nothing wrong in it. But when it comes to divorce, there are other provisions enabling the wife also under the Hindu Marriage Act. Of course, I don't want to digress here. If two marriages are performed even prior to the coming into force of the Hindu Marriage Act, there are no legal bar before the coming into force of the Hindu Marriage Act. One could think of plurality of wives. So if bigamous marriage had taken place prior to the coming into force of the Hindu Marriage Act, there was no legal bar. But there was enabling provision under the Hindu Marriage Act entitling the wife to avoid the marriage, second marriage. She could seek divorce on that ground. Likewise, if the maintenance is received by her and a period of 1 year has elapsed, there's entitlement to seek marriage on the ground of rape, bestiality, etc. Other grounds are also available to the lady. And if repudiation of marriage has taken place between the age of 15 and 18 years by the girl, then that also constitutes a good ground for seeking divorce. There are additional provisions enabling the wife to seek divorce. I'm not on that. So these are some of the gray areas on which act has to be. And let me incidentally touch upon other aspects of the Special Marriage Act. Other day, I think last week, we had the privilege of attending another webinar. Dr. Rupa, is it Dr. Rupa, if I'm correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Rupa?
It was Dr. Rupa, yes.
And Dr. Rupa highlighted the scope of Foreign Marriage Act and binding nature of orders passed by foreign courts and the coercive measures that can be taken by family courts in securing the presence of NRI and all those things. I don't want to offer recapitulation of all those provisions here. But one thing I want to say in this context is the marriage can be performed in foreign country also. There is an act called Foreign Marriage Act enacted by Parliament. The only condition of such a marriage is one of the parties should be Indian citizen of India, for performance of marriage under the Foreign Marriage Act. And there are again two modes of recognizing the foreign marriage. The word foreign marriage is not defined under the Foreign Marriage Act. Foreign country is defined, not the foreign marriage. Foreign marriage can be performed abroad, outside India. And one of the parties should be Indian citizen. That's all the condition. Again, there are two modes of recognizing foreign marriage. Two modes of marriage as recognized as a Foreign Marriage Act. One is solemnization for followed by registration, like which are noticed in the Special Marriage Act. In a similar way, Foreign Marriage Act also recognizes two modes of marriage, foreign marriages. One is solemnization followed by registration. Other is solemnization in some other form, other law, maybe foreign law, and only registration. Supposing the NRIs prefer to marry in America or Australia, they may solemnize their marriage according to the law in force in America, American law, in other forms. They comply with the requirements of law there. Solemnization of marriage is according to the law prevalent in America or according to American law, let us be more precise. But registration can be done under the Foreign Marriage Act. That's all you should understand. So both these methods are recognized. But the interesting thing is how it has any bearing on the Special Marriage Act, you may ask. Why I am digressing now? It has relevance to the provisions of Special Marriage Act. Any matrimonial relief in respect of marriages performed under the Foreign Marriage Act can be sought only under the Special Marriage Act. Very simple. I hope I made myself clear. Any matrimonial relief in respect of a foreign marriage can be sought under the provisions of Special Marriage Act only. That is the legal requirement. There is no provision of the Foreign Marriage Act to seek matrimonial relief. The aggrieved party who has chosen to get his or her marriage solemnized under the provisions of Foreign Marriage Act must necessarily invoke the aid of Special Marriage Act to seek matrimonial relief. That's the requirement of law. It's stated in the Foreign Marriage Act itself. Before I take you quickly through some of the relevant case law, let me explain to you the spirit of the law. Regarding the examination of the claim of aggrieved party in respect of any matrimonial relief. Of course, that is explained more clearly in Hindu Marriage Act, but you can find a similar provision in Section 34, please. It is for the benefit of judges also who are attending. Kindly examine the spirit of the law contained in Section 34 of the Special Marriage Act. Even if it is a divorce with mutual consent, spirit of the law should be followed. There are many instances of not wanting where it is a fraudulent or a collusive claim. Supposing spouses who are leading immoral life choose to exploit some rich widow. They want to flourish on the proceeds of the loot. Such a possibility can't be ruled out in a modern society. So court should take the decorous precaution of following the spirit of the law contained in Section 34. It's very important for the benefit of judges presiding over family courts. They should basically examine any of the grounds for granting relief exists basically. Where the petition is founded on the grounds specified in Clause A of subsection 1 of Section 27. What is Clause A of Section 27? Ground for seeking divorce, that is adultery. If adultery is made a ground for seeking divorce, what family court should do? There may be proof of adultery also, I don't say that they have come to the court without any teeth of evidence. There's a proof of evidence. But what court should ultimately examine here? What is the nature of satisfaction? That proof is not alone is not sufficient. There's a distinction between evidence and proof. Proof is different from evidence. Evidence might have been offered before the court. Proof is end result of the persuasion produced by evidence. The end result of the persuasion produced by evidence is proof. What we judges insist is proof, not the evidence. So kindly examine the clauses contained in section 34. When adultery is alleged, what court should examine is whether the petitioner who complains of adultery has in any manner accessory to or connived at or condoned the acts of sexual intercourse referred to there. It's very important. If it is alleged act of adultery, adulterous connection, is a thing of the distant past. Several years have rolled by since the alleged act of adultery took place. What is the propriety in giving way to such a complaint? Supposing in any manner she has colluded or condoned such lapse, then there is no need to rush to the conclusion that there is sufficient evidence to prove this commission of adultery by the husband, etc. So this is how court should examine the spirit of the law. Court should take the decorous precaution of following the spirit of the law. If there is a fraud or undue influence in obtaining the signature of the lady or husband in a petition for divorce by mutual consent, that also needs to be examined carefully. It should not be collusive claim. There should not be unnecessary or improper delay also. That's also equally important. If they choose their own time, auspicious moment to come to the court, there must be sufficient explanation, proper explanation for the delay in approaching the family court. After long lapse, when children come of age and they're going to college, at that juncture, if they approach the court and complain of incompatibility, that cannot be ground to grant the relief. So 34 is mandatory. Kindly follow the spirit of the law. I request the young judicial officers also and young advocates not to lose the spirit of discernment, spirit of perspicacity, spirit of understanding. It's very important. So let me now take you quickly through some of the important decisions, because I had already promised that I will not inflict upon you the long-winded talk. Still, I'm helpless. I want to cover at least few decisions. Of course, there's a reported case where it was held appropriate to grant divorce on ground of irretrievable breakdown of marriage. It's a case pertaining to judicial officers only. Both appellant and respondent happen to be judicial officers. They lived separately for a period of almost 17 years. 17 years they lived separately from each other. So it was a fit case where the court chose to grant a decree for it. Of course, Supreme Court exercised power under 142 here. This is the case of Sukhdev Das versus Rita Mukherjee. Citation is 2017, bracket complete 9 SCC 3632. This is another case. This is a very interesting case. Only I have selected the cases alone I am citing. This is a very interesting case where mother of the either spouse, that is husband, filed a claim before the family court to declare marriage of her son as void, as on the ground of impotency of her son. Of course, he was no more. She wanted the benefits accruing from his service. So there was an impediment in her way. Wife also claimed as a nominee. So she wanted to get rid of her daughter-in-law. Mother came forward and filed a petition before the family court saying that marriage itself is void. How can this lady exist? Marriage is not binding and she cannot claim any share. So this was on the ground of impotence. And the court rightly took the view that this is a personalized ground. Mother cannot make any such claim. Her claim was dismissed. However, she could pursue other remedies available to her in law by way of inheritance and other things. But she cannot seek such matrimonial relief by approaching the family court on the ground that her son was important. It is a personalized ground which can be urged by the wife alone, not by mother. That's a very interesting case. It is a Calcutta decision, 1996, SCC online, Calcutta 229. Of course, this is another case of our own High Court, ILR 2013, Karnataka 793. The Marriage under Christian Marriage Act cannot be dissolved under Special Marriage Act. This is the dictum. There is no scope for dissolving the marriage performed under the Christian Marriage Act under the Special Marriage Act. It is only the Indian Divorce Act which needs to be invoked to claim dissolution of marriage under the Christian Marriage Act. This is the principle laid down. As for a live-in relationship, there is a concept called palimony, not alimony, palimony, P-A-L-I-M-O-N-Y, which is coined by Americans. It is a famous case of a live-in relationship of a famous actor by name Lee Marvin. He had a live-in relationship with a lady by name Michael. They lived together in a live-in relationship, and the lady claimed what is called as palimony, not alimony, P-A-L-I-M-O-N, palimony. Of course, law is not laid down by US Supreme Court in that case, but it is on par with the live-in relationship in India. Law is yet to be settled there. So in another case where the application by wife for on the ground of cruelty was filed, wife made an application to the family court to refer her husband to medical board for examination of his potency. It was undesirable because the ground was only on the ground of cruelty. There was no warrant to make such application. That is a view taken by the court. There's another interesting case. Wife made an application or filed a petition seeking divorce on the ground that husband was impotent at the time of marriage and he continued to remain impotent till the date of filing of the petition for dissolution of marriage. Very interesting case. The defense plea was she always refused to cohabit. Consummation of marriage could not take place successfully. There was always resistance by the wife. She was not willing to cohabit. That was the defense plea. So in that proceeding, husband sought for relief of his medical examination to prove his potency. She resisted that application, saying that at this juncture, the proof of his potency doesn't materialize. It doesn't come in the way of her claim. So what is required to be proved by her is only his impotence at the time of marriage and such continuance of impotence till the date of filing of the petition. Supposing he was to prove his potency during the pendency, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't alter the fact situation. That was her plea. But court declined to uphold her claim and granted relief because it is a matter of proof. It would strengthen the case of this lady only. Suppose he is found to be impotent at that juncture also, it may strengthen her case. Why it should come in the way of such examination, medical examination? Very interesting case. Some of you who are interested to go through the judgment can note down the citation 2000 SCC online Calcutta 113, Calcutta High Court. There are other decisions which I would pass on to Mr. Trivikram if you are interested. So let me not overshoot. So thank you for the patient hearing. As for interaction with the learned members of the bar, all that I can say is law is and has always been ad hoc and ad hominem to a fault. To every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. I try to avoid giving wrong answers. If I speak under correction, you can correct me. Feel free to correct me. One can learn as long as one lives. I consider my little experience as only a license to study. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free, because we are running out of time already since 7:35, if I'm correct. Sorry, Mr. Trivikram.
Never mind, sir.
I could not fulfill my promise of covering the subject in the time slot.
Thank you, sir, for our enlightening session. Nevertheless, it was worth spending time. So never mind if you have exceeded 5-10 minutes. So with your permission now, we will be moving on to the Q&A session, sir. We'll start with Mr. N.S. Satyanarayan Gupta. I have unmuted you, sir.
Good evening, Ishwar Antin.
Good evening, sir.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good, thank you. Marriages are made in heaven. Some marriages are suffered in this earth. Now, coming to the Special Marriage Act, if the Hindus marries under the Special Marriage Act, either Chapter 2 or Chapter 3 of the Special Marriage Act, so what about the succession to the properties of the couple, whether under the
Succession is it's a good question. I'm happy about it.
Hindu, whether it is Hindu Succession Act or Indian Succession Act.
If both the spouses are Hindus, it is only the Hindu Succession Act only. Because
but we don't get it nowhere.
No. Please read section 21.
21 of?
One minute. I will take you to the relevant. Chapter 4, please, Mr. Gupta. Kindly go to chapter 4 and section 21A.
Of the Hindu Marriage Act?
No. Special Marriage Act.
Okay. Second, please repeat.
Marriage and Special Marriage Act. See, initially sections 9, of course, sections 19 to 21 are intact. Legislature has not disturbed those provisions. But initially, if you go by the provisions contained in section 19, 20, and 21, what they say is, the marriage solemnized under this act of any member of an undivided family who professes Hindu religion shall be deemed to effect his severance from such family.
Okay.
There is severance. There is severance from such family. There is severance of his status from Hindu family. That is the legal consequence of marrying under the provisions of Special Marriage Act. Please go to section 21A. If both the spouses are Hindus, section 19 to 21 will not be attracted. They stand excluded. Their application stands excluded in view of section 21, which came to be enacted. There's a legislative change, what you can notice here.
Okay.
21A specifically says that the application of sections 19 to 21 dealing with severance of his status from joint family is not there. They continue to be Hindus only for the purpose of inheritance.
Okay. By way of amendment, it has come.
21A, yes.
Yeah, 21A. Okay. Thank you, Antin. Wonderful.
Thank you, sir. Now I'll be unmuting. All right, Mr. Harish. Yes, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Sir, today the prenuptial agreement has become the order of the day in all matrimonial alliances. Okay. So, what is the legal validity of the prenuptial agreements under the Special Marriage Act?
They cannot have any effect according to me. There can't be a recognition of marriage under different acts. See, when we go to DV Act, Mr. Harish,
Yes, sir.
there's a recognition of a live-in relationship.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court makes distinction between two kinds of marriage. Live-in relationship simpliciter, they say. Live-in relationship in the nature of marriage. That's a distinction that's made by the Honorable Supreme Court. It is only the live-in relationship in the nature of marriage which is recognized as marriage for the purpose of granting relief under the DV Act, that is the protection of women from domestic violence. Whether that marriage holds good for the purpose of seeking matrimonial relief under any of the special enactments like Special Marriage Act or Hindu Marriage Act, there is a core issue that calls for consideration. I don't think it's permissible. Only for the limited purpose of seeking relief under the protection of domestic, protection of women from domestic violence act is fine. And a live-in relationship can be treated as a marriage for the limited purpose of seeking relief under that enactment, but certainly not under these enactments, special enactments, unless there is a legislative change according to me. There must be legislative change. Yes, please.
Sorry.
1 minute, please hear me out. If there are legislative changes under the Special Marriage Act and the Hindu Marriage Act to the effect that even the live-in relationship in the nature of marriage should be treated as a marriage, valid marriage, then parties entitled to seek matrimonial relief under these acts, not otherwise according to me. Otherwise, it's only permissible under the relevant law dealing with violence against women, only for the limited, but not otherwise. What is your question you wanted to explain?
I to add to what I was trying to say is the parties enter into a prenuptial agreement and register that agreement along with the registration of their marriage as an annexure. Then what is its binding effect?
Marriage, solemnization is a must according to me. Without solemnization, how can?
No. Along with the solemnization, they annex this prenuptial agreement also as part because of the properties to be shared and which is to be treated as separate properties, which are treated as co-ownership properties and things like that.
If it is contrary to any substantive law like a Hindu Succession Act or this Indian Succession Act, I don't think such an agreement is permissible. Law which is contrary to law, any agreement contrary to law in force is not valid. It can be ignored. It has no effect according to me. Unless it is in conformity with the law which is in force, any agreement is not valid. Why should be given effect to if it is contrary to law which is in force? All agreements are
against public policy.
That is a public one. Even definition of section 10, if you go by the definition of contract contained section 10, what does it say? All agreements are contract if they are made by free consent of the parties, competent to contract and for a lawful consideration and with a lawful object, and are not hereby expressly declared to be void by any law in force. That is the implication here. If there is any agreement contrary to the law in force, it need not be taken notice. That's how I understand. Thank you.
So all prenuptial agreements are like against public policy, basically. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Mallikarjun, you may pose your question very quickly. We are running short of time.
Yes. Very good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Very good evening, Trivikram also. Sir, it is a very remarkable and detailed session. So leaves no stone unturned. So I have two questions. One question already put Senior Advocate Satyanarayana Gupta. It's my first question. So you are already answered. My second question is, see, there is also discussion about Hindu Marriage Act. So consequence of section 9, I have a question. Please see that.
Section 9 of?
Hindu Marriage Act.
Yes, sir.
Restitution of conjugal rights.
Restitution of conjugal rights. You're right.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So in this case, husband filed a divorce petition on the ground of cruelty and desertion of marriage that came to be dismissed in the lower court, high court, and even in the Supreme Court. That battle took around 20 years. Later, wife filed a petition under section 9 for seeking restitution of the conjugal right that has been also decreed in favor of the wife. Even after the decree, she made no attempt to come and join the husband for a period of almost 4 years. She never filed an execution petition or issued any legal notice. Still, she is receiving compensation, monthly maintenance from the husband. Now they are almost separate, almost 22 years now. So what is the recourse available for the husband? Whether should he go for the judicial separation or he can go for the divorce petition? Whether it amounts to res judicata already since his earlier petition
It's already benefit of divorce.
Divorce that is came to be dismissed even the Supreme Court on the basis of the decree which is non-performed. So under section 9 of
What
the
were the grounds on which divorce was initially granted to the husband? I mean, it is dismissed.
on the ground of cruelty and desertion.
Cruelty and desertion were not upheld, according to you. Grounds of cruelty and desertion.
Even Supreme Court dismissed. Even now, almost 22 years, they are living separately. Wife is still, even after restriction of the conjugal rights, also wife is still taking monthly maintenance. Even after 5 years of restriction, decreed the suit, she has not made an attempt to come and reside with the husband. What are the recourse available for this?
Yes, I understood your question. As I understand, it is open to the husband to seek cancellation of this order for maintenance in view of non-compliance with the order for restitution.
That is different issue. What is about the marriage? Now, whether we can go for another petition for the divorce on the ground of different under section 9 of non-performance?
No. See, it is not executed. Decree for restitution of conjugal rights is not executed. Is it not? She has not complied with that.
Obviously.
There is no need to ask for further orders on that. It becomes unavailing for the lady. And she should face the consequences of non-compliance with that order. It is her own, it is an order in her favor.
So now the remedy open for the husband to go for, again, he has to file a divorce petition.
It may not be necessary according to me. Why should he unnecessarily take the trouble?
Still the marriage is not dissolved, no?
No, marriage is already, it is dismissed once.
Yeah.
Once
Supreme Court already dismissed, no?
That is on different grounds.
Yeah, different grounds.
You are right. Then I agree with you. Since it is already dismissed on other grounds, for non-compliance with this restitution of conjugal rights, he can now seek divorce.
Okay.
That is how I understand. Because that is a proper course for the husband. I mean, he may as well seek for a cancellation of maintenance on the ground of failure to comply with the order for restitution of conjugal rights.
In the same petition, he can claim for the cancellation of the maintenance as well as the decree for divorce.
It can be done. It should be done. There should not be any technical difficulty. The substantive relief is to ask for a divorce on the ground that one period of 1 year has expired since the date of restitution of conjugal. There is no compliance. In fact, that ground is open to the lady, strictly speaking, because she is the beneficiary of that order.
Obviously.
She has that right. Whether husband can avail that benefit is again debatable, but still I feel that it may be open because there is no non-compliance with that order.
Yeah.
Non-compliance with that order. And there is no divorce in his favor. In view of the order, in view of the lapse of 1 year from the date of passing of the restitution of conjugal, order for restitution of conjugal rights, it may be open to the family court to examine the claim of the husband, since there is no compliance with the decree for restitution. Restitution of conjugal rights should be applicable equally to both parties. Though it is passed in favor of one party, it is applicable unless both parties unite. There is no meaning to restitution of conjugal rights. Though the decree is in favor of wife, generally speaking, it entitles the wife to wait for a period of 1 year and ask for divorce. That is not done here. She has not sought for divorce. On the other hand, she is taking advantage of her own order in her favor. She has not complied with that order. That gives rise to cause of action to the husband to seek cancellation of maintenance, firstly. And according to me, he can as well ask for a divorce on that ground. Since the period of 1 year has lapsed and there is no compliance with the decree for a restitution of conjugal rights, I am entitled to seek divorce. It may be open to him. According to me, family court should consider it favorably.
Thank you, sir. Now I am unmuting Mr. K.R. Ashok Kumar. Sir, very quickly, please pose your question.
Sir, good evening, sir. Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Then my question is, how to prove the adultery is a very difficult task. Can you give some tips in our conducting the cases, sir?
their movement and other things, they're staying together and some proof of their stay in a lodge. Why a husband should move with another lady? If they have gone to a movie together, in normal circumstances, he's not expected to go to a movie along with a stranger. Is it not? If he's a close relative, it is understandable. If there is a proof of they're moving together, going to mall together, having a late night dinner together, that could be sufficient proof, some photographs or some bills regarding the stay in a lodge, purchases, whatever, there can be sufficient proof, you know. Evidence can always be offered to prove such facts. It may not be direct evidence of intercourse as such, but still movement, unless there are other reasons like colleagues moving together, is different thing. Colleagues or close relatives, moving with close relative or colleague is different from moving with a stranger or with whom he has adulterous connection. And the character is also relevant in the criminal proceeding. So this proceeding in the family court, they partake the nature of both criminal and civil. Some matters partake the nature of civil proceeding. Others, like maintenance proceeding, partake the nature of criminal proceeding, as you know. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. Before we wind up, we have our secretary, Mr. A.N. Gangadharaya, who has a question. Yes, sir.
Antin sir, good evening, sir. Wonderful session, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Matrimonial side. I just want an hint from your expertise. You told while saying that waiver of the statutory period of 6 months. So, any citations latest, perhaps?
Number of citations are there. Supreme Court starting with. That is mutual consent, you know.
Yes, yes, sir. 13B1.
13. Amardeep Singh case, the first and the foremost case. Amardeep Singh versus Harveen Kaur, AR 2017. You can note down the citation. Amardeep Singh versus Harveen Kaur, Kaur.
Thank you very much.
Is AIR 2017 SC page 4417. It is followed by Karnataka High Court also.
Yes.
The recent judgment is Sonia alias Deepika versus Manoj Kumar, disposed of on 18/4/19.
Thank you very much, sir. We are indebted to your Honor's service in educating the members of the bar. Whenever our bar demands are asked, Your Lordship, Your Honor is well aware and ready to share the knowledge. That is our privilege.
It is my privilege to embrace the concerns of our association.
Great
I belong to
privilege of
Bangalore
you,
Bar.
Greatness of you. We are indebted for you. Thank you.
Thank you for the good words. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Once again, on my behalf and behalf of Advocates Association Bengaluru, my heartfelt thanks to you, sir, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With your permission now, we'll be signing off today's session.